My name's Daniel Carter. I'm a retired paramedic from the Monterey Bay area in California. I've spent most of my adult life responding to emergencies, running toward danger when most people are running away. I thought I'd seen just about everything a human being could see. But back in the mid-90s, during one relentless winter flu season, I learned I was wrong. What I'm about to share isn't the kind of story you tell casually at a dinner table. For years, I didn't talk about it at all. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't have the words. And honestly, I didn't think anyone would believe me. When you've been trained to think in terms of vitals, symptoms, and protocols, something like this doesn't fit neatly into any box. But over time, I realized keeping it locked inside was like denying something sacred. It wasn't just an odd memory. It was a turning point in my life, and whether people believe it or not, it happened. I'll start with the night it all unfolded. It was 1995, and the county was in the grip of a vicious flu outbreak. Not the kind where you call in sick and binge-watch TV for a few days. This strain was brutal. The ERs were spilling over into hallways. Waiting rooms were jammed with people hunched over in chairs, pale and shaking, vomiting into plastic bags. Ambulances were running non-stop. One call was barely finished before the next came in. I was stationed at Rescue 14 that week. The station was on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, but there was nothing quiet about our shift. We'd been on the road almost the entire night. By the time the call came in for a woman with severe respiratory distress, I'd lost track of how many patients we'd transported. We pulled up to a modest single-story house with the porch light on. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with that stale scent that comes from not opening a window in weeks. Every curtain was drawn. The woman was in her bedroom, propped against pillows, her breathing rapid and shallow. Her skin had that grayish undertone I'd learned to recognize instantly, the color that says, "This is bad." My partner began setting up the oxygen tank while I maneuvered to her side of the bed. Space was tight, so I had to climb partly over her to get the mask in place. I adjusted the strap, sealing it snug over her nose and mouth. That's when it happened. She let out a forceful exhale, and I happened to inhale at the exact same moment. I felt it. Warm air, heavy with moisture, seemed to go straight into my lungs. Now, in our line of work, you get exposed to a lot. Bloodborne pathogens, airborne viruses, it comes with the territory, but something about that moment stayed with me. I brushed it off at the time because the job wasn't about me. I focused on stabilizing her, loading her into the ambulance, and getting her to the hospital. 2 days later, my body reminded me in no uncertain terms that it was about me now. It started with a dull ache, then waves of nausea so intense I couldn't stand for long. My stomach emptied in both directions, over and over, until I was so dehydrated my lips cracked and my skin felt papery. Every muscle ached, but the worst part was my heart. My resting pulse was skyrocketing, 150 beats per minute, steady, pounding in my ears. I checked my radial pulse, pressing 2 fingers just below my wrist. It was so faint I had to concentrate to find it at all. Training kicked in. Low pulse strength usually means low blood pressure, and I guessed mine was under 80 systolic. That was serious territory. I called my sister, barely able to speak without getting winded. She dialed 911. Santa Cruz County Fire arrived within minutes. They started 2 IV lines in the back of the ambulance, hanging bags of saline to try to rehydrate me. We ran code 3, lights and sirens, heading north to a hospital in Watsonville, one of the few facilities not completely swamped. The ER looked like a war zone. Beds were jammed so close you could barely walk between them. Everyone seemed to be hooked up to fluids, some with oxygen masks strapped tight, others curled into fetal positions shivering under thin blankets. The supervising doctor was moving from bed to bed, issuing the same set of orders in rapid fire: a pain medication, a drug for nausea, and more fluids. I remember telling one of the nurses that I was starting to feel a little better with the IVs. I suggested maybe I could go home and begin treatment there. She gave me a polite but firm smile and said, "No, doctor's orders. Everyone's getting the same protocol." I didn't argue. When you've been on the other side of that conversation as many times as I have, you tend to give the benefit of the doubt. She connected a syringe to my IV port and injected both drugs in a single push. Here's what I didn't realize at that moment. I didn't actually need either of them. I wasn't in significant pain, and the nausea had mostly subsided. The medications were strong. One was a synthetic opioid, the other an antiemetic. My wife, who was sitting nearby, said it happened in seconds. My eyes rolled back like a switch had been flipped, my body went limp, and I fell backward onto the bed. What happened next is her story, not mine, because I wasn't there for it. She said the staff reacted instantly. They called for Narcan, the drug paramedics use to reverse opioid overdoses, and administered it more than once. They started more IVs, adjusted my bed so my head was lower than my legs, and scrambled to get a blood pressure reading. It barely registered, 40/0. My pulse was weak and thready. They moved me to intensive care. Later, the attending physician explained that the medication had caused massive vasodilation. My blood vessels had relaxed and widened so much that the fluids in my system were spread too thin to maintain proper circulation. Under normal circumstances, it might have killed me outright. The only reason I had any chance, he believed, was my physical conditioning from training for triathlons. My cardiovascular system was unusually efficient at moving oxygen, which kept the absolute worst from happening. But that's the medical side. The real story begins when I left. It was sometime after midnight when I became aware of separation. One moment, I was in that bed, surrounded by machines and people in scrubs. The next, I was not. The shift was instant. And the very first sensation was freedom. Not the kind you feel after a long day or a stressful week, but something deeper, like I had been locked in a cramped, airless room for years, and someone had just swung open the door to a wide, sunlit world. I was surrounded by what I can only describe as living stars, enormous orbs of light, each a different color, some familiar like gold and deep blue, others in shades my earth-trained eyes had no name for. They pulsed gently, radiating warmth that wasn't just physical but emotional. I could feel them welcoming me. And here's the strangest part. I wasn't in a body the way we know it. I felt expanded, almost dissolved, like my edges were gone. I was part of something larger, a luminous cloud of awareness. Every particle of me hummed with an ecstatic joy so pure it brought me to what would have been tears if I'd had eyes to cry with. It was intoxicating, like warm honey being poured over every part of my consciousness, seeping into every corner of who I was. I remember a laugh bubbling up from somewhere inside me, not because of humor, but because the relief was too immense to contain. And in that moment, I realized something unsettling. I had forgotten who I really was, the life I'd been living as Daniel Carter, paramedic, husband, son. It suddenly felt like a role I'd been playing in a long-running show. The relationships, the responsibilities, even the struggles, they weren't gone exactly, but they were revealed as temporary, like costumes you wear for a time before hanging them back up. As I drifted, or maybe flew is the better word, the orbs stayed with me, moving in slow, graceful patterns. I sensed a shared joy between us, like old friends celebrating a reunion. Then the scene shifted. I landed in what looked like a softly lit chamber. The light was ambient, as if the walls themselves glowed faintly. There were tables, strange equipment, and several beings who were most definitely not human, but not frightening in the least. 3 of them stood right in front of me. They were short, maybe 4 feet tall, wearing deep-colored robes with hoods that shadowed part of their faces. What I could see was round and expressive, with wide, bright eyes and enormous grins. There was a playful energy about them, almost like mischievous children. They spoke all at once, their voices overlapping in excitement. "How was it this time? What can you tell us? What did you learn?" Then one turned to the others, chuckled, and said, "He doesn't remember us." They all burst into laughter. The odd thing was, part of me did remember them, like the echo of a half-forgotten dream, but the memory wouldn't fully surface. That's when another presence entered the room. He was tall, at least 7 feet, with a lean, fluid frame. His form shimmered like he was made of translucent mist, always in motion, like watching something underwater. His smile was warm, his eyes brighter than anything I'd ever seen. He didn't bark orders or carry himself like a commander, but there was an undeniable sense of authority about him, the kind that doesn't come from rank but from wisdom. When he approached me, I was hit with a wave of emotion so strong it almost undid me. My chest swelled, my throat tightened, and if I'd had a physical body, I would have sobbed. The love radiating from him wasn't just directed at me. It was me, like we were made of the same essence. I didn't want to leave, not ever. The tall, mist-like being stood in front of me, radiating a presence that felt ancient and impossibly kind. There was a depth to his gaze that seemed to stretch beyond time itself, as though he could see every version of me, past, present, future, all at once. The 3 robed figures hovered nearby, still smiling like they were in on some private joke. Every so often one would glance at the others as if silently saying, "Wait until he remembers." The tall one finally spoke, his voice like low chimes echoing in a vast space. "So," he said, "what would you like to do?" It wasn't a casual question. It was weighted, though not in a threatening way. It felt like the kind of question you get only a few times in existence, a moment where the choice you make matters on a scale too big to comprehend. "I'm not going back," I said before I even knew I was going to say it. The words came out with certainty, like they'd been sitting in me for centuries just waiting for the chance. He tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "We'll see," he replied gently. There was a pause, and then he said, "Shall we take a look?" I knew instantly what he meant. The review, the infamous life flashing before your eyes that I'd heard so many survivors talk about. Only this wasn't flashing. This wasn't even like watching a movie. It was more like stepping into each memory as though it were happening now. We started with something small, a summer day in my childhood. I was sitting on the cracked steps of my grandmother's porch, a melting popsicle in my hand, watching ants march in perfect lines through the grass. I could feel the heat of the sun on my neck, smell the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine nearby. But I could also feel something else. My grandmother's love for me, hovering like a warm current in the air. It wasn't just the memory of it, it was the actual sensation, present and real. We moved through scenes that seemed random, moments of kindness I'd long forgotten, helping a stranger push a stalled car out of an intersection, giving my lunch to a homeless man who'd been sitting outside the station all day. None of these things had seemed important at the time, but here they were luminous. The emotions rippling from them glowed brighter than the events themselves. And then there were moments of hurt. Times when my words had been sharp or my actions careless. But instead of being judged, I was simply shown. I felt what the other person had felt. The sting of my impatience, the weight of my silence when they'd needed me to speak. It wasn't punishment, it was understanding. We didn't go through my entire life. There was no highlight reel of every bad or good deed. Instead, it felt like the tall being was letting me select a few key notes from a much larger symphony. There was even one memory I brought up, a decision from years earlier when my wife had urged me to take a park ranger job on a remote island for the summer. I'd turned it down, thinking a more practical job closer to home was the wiser choice. In this space, I realized how different that summer could have been. How peaceful, how bonding. It wasn't regret exactly, but more of a quiet recognition that some paths we pass by still echo in us. When that memory faded, I felt a strange stillness. The tall being looked at me with a smile that was both warm and firm. "All right," he said. "It's time to go back." My immediate response was, "No way." The words were almost a laugh, but there was nothing funny about how strongly I meant them. "You've got things left to do," he said simply. I glanced at the three robed figures. They didn't intervene. They just watched with those bright eyes, as if they already knew the outcome. I tried bargaining. "Look, the only people who will really miss me are my wife and my parents. They'll be sad for a while, but they're strong. They'll get through it. Everyone else will be fine." This time he did laugh, a deep, resonant laugh that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "You still don't see," he said. Before I could answer, the room began to change. The light dimmed. The walls blurred, fading into something like mist. I felt a strange pulling sensation, as though my very being was being drawn toward a lower vibration. And then, without warning, the beauty of that place was gone. I was in darkness, not the cozy darkness of a moonless night, but a heavy, airless void. It was cold here, not in temperature but in spirit, a loneliness that felt endless. There was no warmth, no light, and no sense of connection. It was as though I'd been cut off from everything and everyone. I don't know how long I was there. It could have been seconds or centuries. All I knew was that I wanted out. This was not a place to linger. Something deep in me understood. This was close to the physical world, a kind of borderland where lost or confused souls might drift. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I was falling or descending, though not through space the way we know it. It felt like my frequency was dropping, like I was being tuned down on some great cosmic dial. The next thing I remember, I was near my body. I didn't slip into it so much as slam into it. Awareness came in fragments. First, the beeping of monitors, then the weight of blankets, then the ache in every limb, the dryness in my mouth. My eyelids felt glued shut, but I forced them open. I saw the fluorescent ceiling lights of the ICU. The nurse's station is beyond the glass, my own hand resting limply on the bed rail, an IV line taped to the back of it. I caught sight of the monitor. My blood pressure was slowly rising. 44 over 0, then 50 over something, then 60. I drifted in and out, each time catching another few numbers climbing upward. At some point, a nurse noticed I was awake. She walked in, her face breaking into a smile. "Well, look who's decided to join us," she said. I croaked out, "What am I doing back here?" She chuckled. "You were in escrow, honey, but you fell out. Now you're back with us." I knew she was half joking, but my heart sank. I'd been home. I'd been with people or beings who felt like family I'd known forever. And now I was back in a body that ached, in a world that suddenly felt dim by comparison. Over the next few days, the memories of that other place began to fade around the edges. Not completely, the core of it was burned into me, but enough that I could see how easy it would be to convince myself it had been a dream. The mind has a way of doing that, filing away the unexplainable into a drawer labeled probably nothing. But I knew, and I couldn't unknow it. When I was discharged, I tried telling a few people. I said, "There's nothing to be afraid of with death. It's not an ending. It's the best upgrade you'll ever get." I meant it with every fiber of my being. Some people listened, their eyes wide, soaking in every word. Others nodded politely and changed the subject. And a few, especially those I worked with, looked at me like I'd grown a second head. One coworker even pulled me aside one day and said, "You might want to stop telling that story. People are starting to talk." He meant it as friendly advice, but it felt like a door slamming shut, so I zipped my lips and buried the story deep. For 15 years I carried it quietly. It wasn't until I retired that it roared back. I'd have dreams, vivid ones, where I was back in that chamber with the three robed figures or drifting among the orbs of light. I'd wake up with tears on my face and a deep ache in my chest. I started reading. At first, medical journals were looking for any plausible explanation, then accounts of others who'd had near-death experiences. Then I moved into older material, ancient texts, indigenous oral histories, and shamanic traditions. What struck me was that so many cultures had their own version of what I'd seen, not in the same words, but close enough to make me wonder if we were all tapping into the same truth. One thing became clear. What we call reality is just one layer of a much bigger spectrum. There are frequencies and channels beyond this one, just as real, maybe more real, than the one we're in now. When I was there, I could feel that these worlds weren't somewhere else. They were right here, woven into the same space, just vibrating differently. And the biggest revelation of all? When I left my body, I was still me. My humor, my thoughts, my curiosity, it was all intact. Death didn't erase me, it stripped away the limits. That's why I tell people now, we've never truly lost anyone. Our loved ones, our pets, even those we barely knew, they're still here, just on a different channel. The connection doesn't die. Every once in a while, someone will come to me after losing a parent, a partner, or a child. They'll be drowning in grief, desperate for some kind of anchor. And I tell them the same thing I wish someone had told me before all this. They didn't go anywhere. They just stepped into the next room. And one day, when it's your turn, you'll understand exactly what I mean. What do you think this experience means? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe, and remember, every soul has a story worth telling.